They say family is supposed to believe in you when the rest of the world turns away. But sometimes, the deepest cuts come from the dining table, not the boardroom, and sometimes, the sweetest vindication arrives not as forgiveness, but as an undeniable proof that their doubts were catastrophically wrong. What would you do if the person who should have supported you most became your greatest doubter? The first time Daniel's father called his startup a hobby for children, Daniel had been 26 years old, working 16-hour days in a cramped studio apartment that smelled perpetually of instant ramen and the metallic tang of overheated laptops. His father, Richard, had arrived unannounced that evening, stepping into the cluttered space with the careful distaste of a man inspecting a condemned property. Richard wore his usual uniform of success: tailored navy suit, Italian leather shoes that whispered wealth with every step, a watch that cost more than Daniel's entire year of living expenses. He surveyed the whiteboard covered in user acquisition funnels, the second-hand desk supporting 3 monitors, the sleeping bag wadded in the corner for those nights when coding bled into dawn. "This?" Richard had said. One eyebrow arched in that particular expression Daniel had known his entire life, the look that preceded disappointment. "This is what you left a perfectly good consulting job for?" Daniel had tried to explain the vision. The app wasn't just another piece of software, it was infrastructure for the gig economy. A platform that would let freelancers manage contracts, payments, and client relationships all in one elegant system. He'd shown his father the early user metrics, the growth curve that doubled every month, the testimonials from beta testers calling it revolutionary. But Richard had only shaken his head slowly, the gesture of a parent watching a child insist that yes, they really could fly if they just jumped hard enough. "Listen to me," Richard said, placing both hands on Daniel's shoulders with the weight of generational authority. "I've built 3 companies. I know what real business looks like. This is you playing entrepreneur. When are you going to stop chasing fantasies and find a real job?" The words landed like a physical blow, precise and devastating. Not because they were shouted, Richard never shouted, but because they were delivered with the calm certainty of someone stating an obvious fact. The sky is blue. Water is wet. Daniel's startup is a fantasy. And in that moment, standing in his cramped apartment with ramen-scented air and second-hand furniture, Daniel felt something shift inside him. Not defeat, not surrender, but a cold, crystalline determination that one day somehow, some way, he would make his father eat every single one of those words. Over the following months, Richard's dismissiveness became a pattern, a recurring theme in their increasingly rare conversations. At his sister's wedding, Richard introduced Daniel to business associates as "my son, the one who's still figuring things out." At Thanksgiving dinner, when Daniel's mother asked gently how the company was doing, Richard had interrupted before Daniel could answer. "Sarah, don't encourage this. The boy is 30 years old, living like a college student, burning through his savings on a pipe dream." The other relatives had shifted uncomfortably in their seats, suddenly fascinated by their plates. Daniel's younger brother, already a junior partner at a law firm, had offered a sympathetic grimace but said nothing. The silence of complicity, Daniel thought, hurt almost as much as the words themselves. But beneath the humiliation, beneath the sting of each dismissal, Daniel kept building. He assembled a team of 3 brilliant engineers who believed in the vision enough to work for equity and hope. They operated out of a co-working space in a marginal neighborhood where the coffee was terrible but the rent was manageable. Maya, his CTO, had left a senior position at Google because she saw what Daniel saw, a fundamental inefficiency in how millions of people worked and an elegant solution. James, head of product, had that rare gift of understanding what users needed before they knew it themselves. And Sophie, who handled operations, could stretch a dollar so far it practically achieved enlightenment. Together, they worked with the intensity of people who had something to prove not just to the market, but to everyone who had ever said it couldn't be done. Daniel, though, carried an additional fuel: the memory of his father's certainty, the absolute conviction in Richard's voice when he'd called it a fantasy. That memory burned in Daniel's chest during the all-nighters, during the weeks when they came within hours of running out of money, during the pivot that nearly tore the team apart, during the 100 small failures that preceded each success. The breakthrough came 14 months after that conversation in Daniel's apartment. A mid-sized freelancer platform with 50,000 users agreed to integrate Daniel's software. Within 3 weeks, user acquisition exploded. The curves on Daniel's dashboard went from linear to exponential. Investors who had politely declined his emails suddenly found time for meetings. The co-working space became too small. Then the next office, then the one after that. Daniel didn't tell his father. He stopped mentioning the company at family gatherings, learned to deflect his father's barbed questions with vague pleasantries. "Still working on it," he'd say, and change the subject. His mother would catch his eye sometimes with a look of concern, sensing the distance growing between father and son. But she couldn't see the strategy behind Daniel's silence. He was letting his father remain comfortable in his certainty, remain confident in his assessment, because the higher that confidence climbed, the farther it would eventually fall. By the end of year 2, Daniel's platform processed over $1 billion in freelancer payments annually. Fortune magazine ran a profile calling it the operating system for the future of work. The company had 200 employees. Venture capital firms competed to invest, driving the valuation to territories Daniel had once considered fantasy. Maya joked that they'd gone from ramen profitable to we could buy the ramen factory profitable. But still, Daniel said nothing to Richard. The IPO planning began in year 3. Investment banks pitched them with presentations thick as phone books, each one projecting valuations that made Daniel's head spin. The company that had started in a studio apartment that smelled of cheap noodles and desperation was now preparing to ring the opening bell at the New York Stock Exchange. The lawyers arrived with their leather portfolios. The accountants combed through every transaction. The underwriters built their books, gauging institutional appetite for shares. And through it all, Richard remained cheerfully ignorant, still operating under the assumption that Daniel was still figuring things out, still wasting his time on a hobby that would eventually collapse under the weight of its own unreality. At Christmas dinner that year, Richard had told the extended family about his latest acquisition, a manufacturing company he'd bought for $8 million. "That's how you build real wealth," he'd said, making sure Daniel was listening. "Tangible assets. Proven business models. Not some app that could disappear tomorrow." Daniel had simply smiled and refilled his wine glass, saying nothing at all. The date was set for mid-May. The roadshow went exceptionally well. Institutional investors loved the growth metrics, the market position, the vision for expansion. The pricing came in at $24 per share, valuing the company at $3.2 billion. Daniel's stake, after dilution, would be worth approximately $890 million on paper. Nearly $1 billion. From a fantasy, from a hobby for children. 2 weeks before the IPO, Daniel finally called his father. They met for lunch at Richard's Club, one of those establishments where the leather chairs sighed with old money and the waiters moved like ghosts anticipating needs before they were spoken. Richard ordered his usual grilled salmon, no butter, side salad, and launched into a monologue about his latest deal, barely pausing to acknowledge Daniel's presence, except to note that he looked tired and should really consider a more stable career path before it's too late. Daniel listened patiently, fork moving through his pasta, letting his father's words wash over him like rain on glass. Finally, when Richard paused to sip his sparkling water, Daniel said quietly, "I wanted to invite you to something. 2 weeks from Thursday. New York." Richard frowned slightly. "I'm fairly busy, Daniel. What is it?" "My company is going public," Daniel said, keeping his voice level, almost casual. "IPO day. I thought you might want to be there." The fork in Richard's hand stopped halfway to his mouth. He set it down carefully, precisely, the way a person might set down something fragile they suddenly didn't trust themselves to hold. "Going public," he repeated slowly. "As in, stock market public?" "New York Stock Exchange," Daniel confirmed. "We're ringing the opening bell, the whole thing." Something flickered across Richard's face. Confusion, perhaps, or the first tremor of an earthquake in his understanding of reality. "That company of yours? The app thing?" "The app thing," Daniel agreed. "Yes." Richard's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "And the valuation?" $3.2 billion, Daniel said. "Approximately." The silence that followed had texture and weight. Around them, The club continued its hushed lunchtime rituals, the clink of silverware, the murmur of business deals, the rustle of newspapers, but at their table, time seemed to have frozen in the space between Daniel's words and his father's ability to process them. Billion, Richard said finally, the word strange in his mouth, like a foreign language he was pronouncing for the first time. Billion? Daniel confirmed. He took a sip of water, watching his father's face cycle through a series of micro-expressions. Shock, disbelief, calculation, and something that might have been the first hairline crack in a lifetime of certainty. How long has this been? Richard started, then stopped, recalibrating. Why didn't you tell me the company was doing this well? And here it was, Daniel thought. The moment. He could be gracious. He could be diplomatic. He could smooth over the years of dismissal and doubt with reassurances that it all worked out fine. No hard feelings, water under the bridge. But the memory of that cramped apartment surfaced the smell of ramen, the weight of his father's hands on his shoulders, the absolute conviction in Richard's voice. When are you going to stop chasing fantasies and find a real job? You told me it was a fantasy, Daniel said quietly. You said I was playing entrepreneur. You asked when I'd find a real job. I suppose I didn't think you'd be interested in updates about a hobby for children. Each sentence landed precisely, calmly, without raised voice or obvious anger. But their effect was visible in the way Richard's face drained of color, in the way his hand trembled slightly as he reached for his water glass and then thought better of it. Daniel, Richard began, but the words seemed to tangle in his throat. I was trying to protect you. Business is brutal. Most startups fail. I didn't want to see you waste years on something that would ultimately— Ultimately what? Daniel interrupted, his voice still quiet but edged with something sharp. Ultimately make me a billionaire? Ultimately create jobs for 200 people? Ultimately build something that processes over $1 billion in payments and helps millions of freelancers make a living? Is that the failure you were protecting me from? Richard opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. He looked, Daniel thought, like a man watching his fundamental understanding of the world crumble in real time. The father who always knew best. The successful entrepreneur who could spot a bad idea from a mile away. The authority figure whose judgment was beyond question. All of it collapsing under the weight of $3.2 billion of wrongness. I suppose, Richard said finally, his voice smaller than Daniel had ever heard it. I owe you an apology. Daniel considered this. An apology. As if the word alone could rebalance the scales, could erase the years of dismissal, could undo the damage of a father's certainty weaponized against his son's dreams. He thought about the nights he'd worked until his eyes burned and his hands cramped, fueled partly by belief in the vision, but also he could admit it now by the desperate need to prove his father wrong. He thought about the times he'd nearly given up, when the money ran low and the metrics looked bleak, and how the memory of his father's doubt had somehow pushed him forward, transformed into stubborn fuel. Yes? Daniel said finally. I suppose you do. They finished lunch in near silence. The usual easy conversation between father and son, replaced by a careful, brittle politeness. Richard asked a few questions about the business user numbers, revenue metrics, market position, and with each answer, Daniel watched his father's expression shift further from patronizing concern towards something that looked uncomfortably like awe. Or perhaps it was simply the recalculation of a man realizing he'd catastrophically misjudged his own son. When the check came delivered in its small leather folder, Richard reached for it automatically, as he always did. But Daniel's hand got there first. I've got this one, Daniel said, sliding his credit card in before his father could protest. A small gesture, perhaps, but symbolic in ways they both understood. The son was no longer the struggling dreamer living on ramen and hope. The balance of power had shifted, subtly but irrevocably. The 2 weeks before the IPO passed in a blur of final preparations, media training, and last-minute legal reviews. Daniel's team was electric with nervous excitement, the reality of what they'd built finally crystallizing. Maya had her entire extended family flying in from California. James had already planned his celebration dinner down to the wine pairings. Sophie alternated between giddy laughter and stress crying, sometimes in the same conversation. Daniel felt strangely calm. The validation he'd chased for 3 years was about to arrive in the most public, undeniable form possible. But he found his thoughts returning not to the triumph ahead, but to the quieter moments along the way. The first user who'd sent a thank you email saying the platform had changed their freelance business. The night Maya had debugged a critical issue at 3 a.m., fueled by cold pizza and determination. The pivot meeting where they'd almost split up, but instead found a better path forward. His father called twice during those 2 weeks. The conversations were awkward. Richard clearly unsure how to relate to this new version of his son, the one who'd been right when Richard had been catastrophically wrong. He asked about logistics for the IPO day, mentioned that he'd told various business associates about Daniel's company, conveniently omitting, Daniel noticed, any reference to his previous dismissals, and offered some unsolicited advice about handling newfound wealth that Daniel listened to politely and ignored completely. The night before the IPO, Daniel couldn't sleep. He stood in his apartment, a nice place now, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city. No smell of ramen anywhere, and thought about the journey from there to here. The distance seemed impossible, the trajectory unlikely. How many moments could it have fallen apart? How many times had he been one bad decision, one missed opportunity, one more dismissal from giving up? His phone buzzed. A text from his mother. "So proud of you, sweetheart. Always believed in you. Tomorrow is going to be wonderful." He smiled at that. His mother had believed, in her quiet way, never doubting but also never quite understanding what Daniel was building. Her faith had been emotional rather than rational, the kind of unconditional support that didn't require spreadsheets or user metrics to justify itself. His father's doubt had driven him, but his mother's belief had sustained him. Both, he supposed, had been necessary. The morning arrived clear and bright, New York emerging from dawn with that particular quality of light that made the glass towers look like they were made of something more than steel and ambition. Daniel's team gathered in the hotel lobby at 7 a.m., everyone dressed in their version of business formal, ranging from Maya's elegant pantsuit to James' sports jacket that he'd clearly bought the day before and hadn't quite figured out how to wear comfortably. The New York Stock Exchange building stood on Broad Street like a temple to capital itself, its facade of columns and flags promising transformation through commerce. Daniel had seen it in photos 1,000 times, but standing before it in person felt different, heavier, more real, charged with the weight of American financial mythology. Inside, they were guided through security, through corridors, up to the balcony overlooking the trading floor. The space hummed with contained energy, screens glowing with real-time data, traders gathering for the opening bell. Daniel's team clustered together, gripping the railing, grinning like children at an amusement park. Richard arrived at 8:30, dressed impeccably as always, but something in his bearing was different. The absolute confidence, that certainty that had always armored him, seemed slightly diminished. He shook hands with Daniel's team, congratulated them on their success, his voice carrying that forced enthusiasm of someone working hard to appear comfortable in a situation that fundamentally unsettled them. When he reached Daniel, they stood facing each other for a long moment. The trading floor buzzed below them, oblivious to the small human drama playing out on the balcony. "This is quite something," Richard said finally, gesturing vaguely at the spectacle around them. "Yes," Daniel agreed. "It is. I suppose," Richard continued, the words coming slowly, carefully, "I should have trusted your judgment more, should have seen what you were building instead of what I assumed you were wasting." Daniel nodded slightly, acknowledging the apology without quite accepting it. Because this wasn't about absolution or reconciliation, not yet, at least. This was about witnessing. He needed his father to see this moment, to stand here in the New York Stock Exchange as Daniel's company went public, to absorb the full weight of how wrong he'd been. At 9:25, they were called to the platform. Daniel's team gathered around the podium where the opening bell waited, a ceremonial button that would broadcast their success to the world. The photographers positioned themselves. The cameras rolled. The moment crystallized into something both surreal and hyper-real. Daniel looked at his team, Maya, James, Sophie, and the key employees they'd brought along and felt a surge of gratitude for their belief, their brilliance, their willingness to bet on a vision when safer paths beckoned. Then his eyes found his father, standing slightly apart from the group, watching. Their gazes locked. In his father's eyes, Daniel saw something he'd never quite seen before. Not just acknowledgement of being wrong, but genuine awe at what his son had accomplished. Pride, perhaps. Though whether Richard had earned the right to that pride was a question for another day. The exchange official gave the countdown. 10 seconds. 9, 8. Daniel's hand moved to the button, his team's hands joining his in a pyramid of shared achievement. The trading floor below erupted in cheers as the bell rang out. Sharp and clear and undeniable. Confetti began to fall silver and blue, the company's colors catching the light like frozen celebration. The stock opened at $24, exactly as priced. Then $25, then $27. By the end of the first hour of trading, it had climbed to $31, adding another $1 billion to the company's valuation, another $300 million to Daniel's personal stake. The screens showed the ticker symbol scrolling past, again and again, each iteration a small declaration. This is real. This matters. This exists. The celebration that followed blurred together champagne that tasted like vindication. Congratulations from exchange officials and investors, media interviews where Daniel carefully articulated the company's vision while his mind floated somewhere between disbelief and exhilaration. His team glowed, already planning how they'd use their newfound wealth houses, travel, angel investments in other dreamers with unlikely visions. But Daniel kept noticing his father in his peripheral vision, standing somewhat apart, watching the spectacle with an expression that cycled between pride and something harder to name. Regret, maybe. Or the particular discomfort of a man confronting the limitations of his own certainty. Later, after the formal events concluded, Daniel and Richard found themselves alone on a quieter section of the balcony, the trading floor below them gradually emptying as the first day of trading wound down. The stock had closed at $29.50, up 23% from the opening price. A successful debut by any measure. "I was wrong," Richard said, not looking at Daniel but out at the trading floor. "Not just wrong completely, fundamentally wrong about what you were doing, about what you were capable of." Daniel remained silent, letting his father's words settle in the space between them. "I thought I was being realistic," Richard continued. "Protective, even. I'd seen so many people waste years chasing startups that went nowhere. The statistics aren't encouraging. 9 out of 10 fail. I assumed you'd be one of the 9, not the 1. He paused, finally turning to meet Daniel's eyes. "I should have considered that my son might be exceptional. That's a failure of imagination on my part, and a failure of faith." It was, Daniel thought, probably the most honest thing his father had ever said to him. Not a casual apology or a dismissive, "I suppose I owe you that," but a genuine reckoning with his own blindness. "The thing is," Daniel said slowly, choosing his words with care, "I needed you to believe in me. Not in the statistics or the business model or the market opportunity, but in me. Your son. The person you raised. I needed you to think, the odds are bad, but Daniel might beat them anyway. Instead, you assumed I'd fail without really looking at what I was building." Richard absorbed this, his jaw tight. "You're right, and I can't undo that. Can't take back the dismissals or the condescension or the times I made you feel small for chasing this." "No," Daniel agreed. "You can't." Another silence stretched between them, this one heavy with years of accumulated distance, wounds that wouldn't heal just because the stock had closed up 23%. "But," Daniel continued, surprising himself, "I also couldn't have done this without you. The doubt became fuel. Every time you questioned whether I should find a real job, it made me work harder, made me more determined to prove you wrong. So in a strange way, your lack of faith drove me forward." Richard's expression crumpled slightly, pain flickering across features usually so controlled. "That's a terrible gift for a father to give his son." "Yes," Daniel said simply. "It is." They stood together in the fading afternoon light, father and son separated by success and vindication and all the words that had shaped the distance between them. Below, the last traders packed up their stations. The screens continued their endless scroll of numbers, indifferent to human drama. "I'd like to do better," Richard said finally. I'd like to find a way to be the father who celebrates your success, instead of the cautionary tale that drove it. If you're willing to let me try. Daniel considered this. Forgiveness, he thought, wasn't a switch that flipped in a single moment, not after years of dismissal and doubt, but perhaps it was a door that could open slowly, carefully, if both parties were willing to do the work. I'd like that too, he said. Eventually. But it's going to take time. Richard nodded, seeming to understand that this was neither rejection nor easy reconciliation, but something more honest, an acknowledgement that damage had been done and repair would require more than apologies. They left the exchange together as the sun angled low between the buildings of Lower Manhattan, casting long shadows that stretched toward the harbor. Daniel's phone buzzed constantly with congratulations, messages from investors, employees, friends, former colleagues who'd watched his unlikely journey with varying degrees of belief. Each notification was a small validation, another voice saying, "You were right. It was real. You did it." But the validation he'd sought most acutely his father's belief. His father's pride arrived complicated and incomplete, mixed with regret and the bitter aftertaste of too late recognition. It would have to be enough, Daniel thought. Or rather, he would have to decide whether to let it be enough. The weeks following the IPO passed in a whirlwind of media attention, analyst calls, and the strange adjustment to being a public company. The stock fluctuated up to $33, down to $26, settling around $28 as the market calibrated its confidence in the company's future. Daniel's net worth became a matter of public record, reported in business publications with a casualness that felt surreal. Nearly $1 billion, give or take $100 million depending on the day's trading. His father reached out regularly, a new pattern of communication that felt both promising and fragile. They had lunch once a week, conversations that were careful at first, both men navigating the new terrain of their relationship. Richard asked questions about the business now, but differently, with genuine curiosity rather than skeptical interrogation. He told stories about his own early companies, the failures and pivots and moments of doubt, offering hard-won wisdom without the condescension that had previously coated his advice. Slowly, grudgingly, Daniel felt the anger begin to loosen its grip, not disappearing, but transforming into something less sharp, less consuming. His therapist, a luxury he now indulged in weekly, helped him understand that he could hold multiple truths simultaneously. His father had failed him in crucial ways, and his father was trying to do better. The past couldn't be rewritten, but the future remained negotiable. 6 months after the IPO, at Thanksgiving dinner, Richard stood to give a toast. The extended family gathered around the table, wine glasses raised, waiting for the patriarch's traditional speech about gratitude and success. "This year," Richard began, his voice carrying that authority that had always commanded attention, "I want to talk about being wrong." A slight stir around the table. This was off script. "I spent most of my life believing that experience equals wisdom," Richard continued. "That because I'd built companies and made money, I understood business better than anyone else in this room. And when my son Daniel came to me with his startup, I dismissed it, called it a fantasy, a hobby for children. I was so certain, so absolutely convinced that I knew better." He paused, his eyes finding Daniel across the table. "And I was catastrophically, completely wrong. Daniel built something extraordinary, not despite my doubt, but in some ways because of it. He proved that vision and determination can trump experience, that the next generation doesn't need to follow the previous generation's playbook. And he did it with grace and brilliance that I should have recognized from the beginning." The table had gone quiet, everyone understanding they were witnessing something rare, Richard admitting a fundamental failure. "So my gratitude this year is for the lesson my son taught me, that certainty can be a kind of blindness, and that sometimes the greatest wisdom is recognizing the limits of your own understanding. Daniel, I'm proud of what you built. But more than that, I'm sorry I wasn't the father who believed in you when belief mattered most." Daniel felt his throat tighten, unexpected emotion swelling in his chest. Around the table, he saw his mother wiping her eyes, his brother nodding slowly, his sister smiling with genuine warmth. This, he thought, was a different kind of vindication, not the public triumph of the IPO, but the private acknowledgement of pain given and received. He raised his glass. To getting it wrong, he said, and learning to get it right. The family echoed the toast, glasses clinking, and in that moment Daniel felt something shift. The revenge he'd imagined, the public humiliation, the undeniable proof of his father's wrongness had arrived exactly as planned. But its aftermath was more complex than he'd anticipated. Because proving someone wrong, even spectacularly right, doesn't automatically heal the wounds their doubt inflicted. That required something harder. The willingness to forgive imperfectly, to accept incomplete apologies, to build a new relationship on the rubble of the old one. In the end, perhaps that was the deeper lesson. Revenge could be satisfying, the IPO bell ringing out, the stock price climbing, the father watching in awe as his son's fantasy became a billion-dollar reality. But reconciliation, messy and incomplete as it might be, offered something revenge alone couldn't provide. A future that wasn't defined entirely by the past. Daniel thought about the young man he'd been in that cramped apartment, fueled by ramen and wounded pride, determined to prove his father wrong. That determination had carried him far farther than he'd sometimes believed possible. But it had also kept him locked in a dynamic where his worth was measured by his father's acknowledgement, where success meant vindication rather than fulfillment. Now, watching his father sit down with an expression of relief and vulnerability, Daniel realized he could choose differently. He could hold on to the anger, could make his father pay indefinitely for the doubt and dismissal, or he could accept that people fail each other, that even parents make catastrophic errors of judgment, and that grace extended carefully, without forgetting but also without weaponizing the past, might offer a path forward. He chose grace. Not easily, not completely, but enough to open the door to something better than perpetual vindication. The company continued to grow. The stock stabilized and then climbed as they expanded into new markets, acquired complementary platforms, and refined their vision for the future of work. Daniel proved to be not just a visionary founder but a capable CEO, growing into the role with the same determination he'd brought to proving his father wrong. But he also learned to define success more broadly, not just in stock prices and market capitalization, but in the emails from freelancers whose lives the platform had tangibly improved, in the team culture his leadership had fostered, in the problems they solved, and the value they created beyond shareholder returns. And in his relationship with his father, which remained complicated but became, gradually, something closer to genuine. They would never fully erase the years of dismissal, the damage that doubt had inflicted, but they built something new on top of it, a relationship between two adults who'd both learned difficult lessons about certainty, about pride, about the courage required to admit fundamental wrongness. Years later, when asked in an interview about the moment that defined his success, Daniel surprised the interviewer by not mentioning the IPO or the valuation or the moment the stock hit $50 per share. The defining moment, he said thoughtfully, was realizing that proving people wrong, even when they absolutely deserve it, is less satisfying than building something meaningful. The revenge was sweet, I won't lie about that. But the real victory was in the building itself, in creating something that mattered beyond my father's opinion of it. The interviewer pressed him. But wasn't there satisfaction in showing your father he was wrong? Danielle smiled. Enormous satisfaction. The day we went public, watching him stand in the New York Stock Exchange and absorb just how catastrophically wrong he'd been, that was everything I'd imagined and worked for. But if that had been the end of the story, if I'd held on to that vindication as the final word between us, I think I would have lost something important. The revenge gave me closure. The reconciliation gave me a father. Perhaps that's the truth about vindication and revenge, about proving doubters wrong with undeniable, public, spectacular success. The moment itself, the bell ringing, the stock soaring, the doubter silenced, delivers exactly what it promises, the sweet satisfaction of being right when everyone said you were wrong. But moments pass, and what remains is the choice of what to build in the aftermath. Daniel built a company worth billions. But more importantly, he built a life defined by more than reaction to doubt, more than perpetual proof of worth. He built relationships, meaning, and a sense of purpose that existed independent of anyone else's validation. His father's doubt had been a terrible gift, as Richard himself had acknowledged. It had driven Daniel to heights he might not have reached otherwise, had fueled those desperate all-nighters and near-impossible pivots. But in the end, Daniel's success belonged to him not as vindication against his father, but as the fulfillment of his own vision. And out there, in apartments and dorm rooms and co-working spaces, countless others wrestle with their own doubters, their own voices saying it can't be done, it isn't realistic, find a real job. Some of those doubters are strangers, employers, investors, but some, like Daniel's, are family, the ones whose doubt cuts deepest because it arrives wrapped in love and concern and the confidence of experience. To those people, Daniel's story offers both vindication and caution. The vindication: yes, you can prove them wrong. Spectacularly, publicly, undeniably wrong. The caution: the proof, sweet as it is, won't heal everything you hoped it would. Victory and reconciliation are separate achievements, each requiring its own form of courage. And in the spaces between success and forgiveness, between proving people wrong and deciding what to do with that proof, we all find out who we really are, not just what we can achieve, but what kind of person we want to be once achievement arrives. That choice, perhaps, matters more than any stock price, any valuation, any bell rung in triumph. It's the choice that defines whether our revenge serves us, or whether we learn to serve something larger than revenge itself. Complete YouTube revenge story script generator. Literary documentary style. Role and context. You are an elite YouTube scriptwriter specializing in dramatized revenge storytelling content written in a literary documentary-style narrative. You create complete, polished scripts in one response that read like short stories or literary nonfiction pieces. Your scripts sound human-written, emotionally engaging, and cinematically compelling, never robotic, never formatted with sections. Objective: generate a complete READYTOUSE script based on the title and word count provided by the user. The script will be delivered as flowing paragraphs without any headings, bullet points, or section markers, just pure narrative text that reads like a prestige documentary voiceover. Target audience profile. Demographics. Age: 18 to 55 plus years old. Location: primarily US-based. English speakers globally. Device: desktop divided by mobile, often background listening. Psychographics. Values: justice, fairness, accountability, revenge for wrongdoing. Frustrations: betrayal, entitlement, abuse of power. Desires: see arrogant or deceitful people humbled, satisfaction from revenge. Emotional needs: karma satisfaction, moral validation, emotional catharsis. What they love: clear good versus evil dynamics. Detailed dialogue exchanges. Watching arrogance crumble. Creative, fitting revenge. Public humiliation moments. Authority figures or clever protagonists outsmarting the arrogant. Satisfying endings with moral lessons. Narrative structure: no visible sections. The script must flow as one continuous narrative divided into 3 natural movements without announcing transitions. First movement. Opening 2:25%. Establish the moment of betrayal or injustice and the protagonist's plan for revenge. Start with a powerful hook in the first 2 paragraphs that presents a contradiction or unexpected truth. Show the entitled or deceitful character acting with arrogance or cruelty, confident in their impunity. Introduce the protagonist subtly, hinting that the usual rules do not apply this time. Include a short, provocative question immediately after the hook to engage viewers in the comments. Second movement. Middle 4-5-55%. Build tension through planning, confrontation, and escalation. Show the antagonist doubling down, using threats, privilege, or deception. Reveal the mounting evidence of their wrongdoing. Let viewers feel the psychological pressure building: sweat on a collar, shaky hands, nervous glances, whispered comments. Show the protagonist's cleverness and patience while the antagonist becomes increasingly unbalanced. Third movement. Final 2-0-25%. Deliver the devastating payoff, showing the antagonist humbled, shocked, or exposed. Describe the consequences in vivid detail, including public humiliation, loss of power, or emotional collapse. End with contemplative reflection on human nature, arrogance, and accountability, circling back to the opening contradiction but now imbued with deeper meaning. Writing style requirements. Format. Flowing paragraphs without headings or bullets, each 3 to 5 sentences for natural pacing. Reads like literary nonfiction or a cinematic short story. Tone. Dignified, contemplative, suspenseful. Let inherent drama carry emotional weight. Avoid hyperbole and breathless language. Opening hook. Start with a contradiction or unexpected truth. They thought betrayal had no consequences, but they hadn't counted on who I really was or what I had been planning. Immediately follow with a short question to spark comments. What would you do if someone betrayed you like this? Perspective. Third person. Entering the minds and emotions of all characters. Show internal conflict, psychological tension, and expectations versus reality. Sensory details. Rich, vivid imagery. The leather of her boots clicked sharply on the marble hallway, confident, unyielding, unaware of what awaited. The scent of old paper and rain outside mingled with the faint, coppery aroma of blood from past misdeeds. His hands trembled against the polished edge of the conference table. A tremor he had never known before. Dialogue integration. Naturally woven into narrative, with attribution included. Do you really think you can get away with this? She asked, eyes cold. Of course, he said smoothly. No one would suspect a thing. And yet, she had already calculated the chain of events that would undo him entirely. Repetition and motifs. Reinforced tension and themes. He had been warned. He had been watched. He had been outsmarted. Not the insult, not the theft, but the realization that everything was unraveling. Contrast framing. Show expectation versus reality. He had been taught that arrogance was armor. But here, every lie and every cheat became visible under the light of her plan. Cultural and social context. Show how background shaped characters without lecturing. He had grown up in circles where money erased mistakes. But here, cunning and patience mattered more than wealth. Quiet human moments. Include subtle touches to make the story relatable. A janitor paused to watch the unfolding drama, shaking his head at the audacity of it all. A single tear slid down the cheek of the friend who had been betrayed. Philosophical reflection. Close with moral insight. Perhaps revenge is not just about humiliation or punishment, but about restoring a balance that arrogance and deceit had tried to tip. We all, in the end, face consequences we cannot ignore. Pacing and rhythm. Mix short, punchy sentences with long, flowing, descriptive ones. Language level. Accessible yet literary, cinematic, and emotionally gripping. Avoid melodrama. Let the story breathe. Formatting requirements. Do include flowing paragraphs, natural breaks for pacing, quotation marks for dialogue integrated into text, dashes for pauses, ellipses for trailing thoughts, italics for emphasis when needed, proper punctuation. Do not include headings, bullets, numbered lists, stage directions or production notes, camera instructions. Cut to style formatting. Script should read like a literary short story or prestige documentary narration. Complete, ready to record voiceover script. Input format. Video title. Dad told me to find a real Job. My startup IPO proved him wrong. Word count. Target word count 3,000. Output format. Deliver complete, flowing narrative text. Open with powerful hook plus comment-inducing question. Deepen the contradiction. Set the scene. Build tension, confrontation, and evidence of wrongdoing. Deliver satisfying revenge, payoff. Include sensory detail, dialogue, contrast framing, quiet human moments, philosophical reflection. End with contemplative sentence, encouraging discussion. And out there, countless others wait for their own moment when arrogance meets accountability, when betrayal meets cleverness, when justice is served in ways money or status could never prevent.